And I say little one like they're kids because they're my kids. I don't know how you do that. These drugs that we're using for allergies in particular, they're expensive.
Dogs generally are very intelligent and much more connected to their natural instincts than, say, us humans. The earth, the soil is the original microbiome. That's where we got our microbiome from, so as dogs.
Hey there, I am Melissa Natanson, canine nutritionist, pet health coach, and your pet's gut health advocate. If you have felt like you have tried everything when it comes to allergies and haven't gotten anywhere, you're not crazy. I know, because I've been there, and it is what led me to specialize in GI health, and I realized that all roads lead to the microbiome. Today, we're joined by Jason Klop, the co-founder of Legacy Biome, and he has been deep in the world of functional medicine and microbiome therapy for years. We are going to talk about FMT, allergies. We're going to do some price comparisons and why FMT should be a first resort and not a last resort, and something we can look at as a real solution, because gut health isn't a trend. It is here to stay, and it can be foundational. Hey, Jason.
Hello, happy to be here and excited to dive in.
Yeah, I'm excited to dive in too. This is like my favorite topic, as it is yours.
It is, yeah. As you pointed out, my background's actually in human healthcare. So I spent many years treating patients, human patients, with FMT products, and still involved in that world. But in the interim, got involved in the pet health space as well, just because, well, I love pets. And it so happens that FMT and microbiome therapeutics can be revolutionary for both pets and humans. Although today we're going to focus predominantly on our pets.
That's right. So when did the light bulb go off for you when making the transition from humans to pets, when you're like, hey, this is an underserved part of a way that we can support our little ones?
Yeah, I mean, you can probably relate to this, and it's changing, and it has been changing for the last 5 years. But really, veterinarians and pet health coaches alike would typically go to human healthcare conferences because there just weren't a lot of integrative, sort of functional pet conferences where people could learn about how to use, more natural, holistic treatments for their pets. And since I was involved in, FMP treatment and attending a lot of conferences, human healthcare conferences with other healthcare providers, I would occasionally run into veterinarians who were also attending those same conferences to learn about how to apply the same principles of human healthcare to pet care. Because really there's a lot of overlap and a lot of the same treatments, even drugs, generally are often first approved in humans and then later on used and approved in pet care for treating all sorts of conditions. And so I'd be meeting these veterinarians, and I would ask them, what's happening in the pet health world when it comes to utilization of FMT treatments? And I'd get all kinds of answers, but oftentimes people were saying, we're using this. It's been used in large animal, especially in horses, for many, many years. And there were a few players and few vets, Dr. Margot Roman being one of them, who really pioneered this in smaller animals, dogs and cats. And it was sort of having those discussions and realizing, look, if we're doing manufacturing for humans and we've got all of this knowledge and experience, why don't we duplicate what we're doing in a different setting, in a different lab for pets? And we really carried over two things that I think are really a distinction for us. One being our manufacturing capacity and ability. So we take a very similar approach to producing a human drug to also producing the same version, but also obviously for dogs. That would be the number one. And then I think the other that is really a distinction is our focus and real belief in the importance of the donor and the donor network, the quality of the donor, the donor's medical history, their microbiome health, their diet, all of these factors that we know to be really true and imperative for human treatment are a direct carryover in how we find ourselves differentiated in this big market to really get the best from a safety and an efficacy standpoint.
Absolutely. And that's part of the reason why I teamed up with you guys. You are the premier company with the quality standards that I trust. And why? because I have used Legacy Biome with my own dog. And unfortunately, I did use it as a last resort. Why? Because I didn't know. And that's why we're here today. We're here to make this part of the conversation. Again, like I said, all roads lead to the gut. And when it comes to allergies, it is not an Apoquel deficiency. It is not a cytopoint deficiency. It is a microbiome insufficiency. And so if your little one is, and I say little one like they're kids because they're my kids. I don't know how you do that. Maybe I should say your little pumpkin pets. But if they're dealing with the allergies, I can say almost 100%. And Jason, you tell me if you agree, there's a microbiome imbalance. And so this is where we have to get to the root, because no amount of Apoquel, Cytopoint, or Atopica is going to get to the root. It's just going to cover the symptoms. And I think this is something really important that both Jason and I want you as pet parents to know, because these drugs that we're using for allergies in particular, they're expensive. I have been going through some of the costs on these things. Jason, we're going to get into, I've seen a lot of comments just on social media or wherever that the Legacy Biome FMT is generally $199 for 1 month. And people say, wow, that's expensive for poop. But I want you to explain why that's actually a pretty darn good deal.
Yeah, I mean, leaving out the costs of other treatments, we have patients, pet parents who reach out to us, and they've been through the rigmarole of the testing, the treating, all of the diagnostics that are involved. And some have reached up to $10,000, $20,000, and we've seen even higher than that for some things that could be treated from a much more foundational approach. And I think that's really the goal here. The goal isn't to have your pet on something for their lifetime, which, depending on how old they are, could be a very long time still. The goal is to try to address the underlying causes of whatever it is they're experiencing, whether it's diarrhea or, in the context of this conversation, allergies. But what people, I think, sort of fail to appreciate is there's a lot that goes into making the product. It's quite a manual process. It's not a synthetic thing like a probiotic. We can't just grow this. It comes from actual donor dogs, and there's a limited number of them that can be used because so much effort goes into raising them in a holistic, naturally reared way. Their diet is very clean, organic, whole food shopping, which if anybody spends any time at whole paycheck, as some people jokingly call it, they'll know that just feeding the dog a raw organic diet becomes very, very expensive. So just the donor network and the costs that are involved in raising and taking care of, collecting and processing the samples themselves is quite time and labor intensive. So there's that aspect to it. And then the other part of this is that, we only have a limited amount of product that we're using, and a limited amount of donors that would even match the criteria. We could easily, and it would be a whole lot easier logistically and cost-wise for us to just simply use a subpar donor, fed a kibble diet, does the testing, but the testing's, fairly easy to pass if you're just looking to screen out, say, parasites or other pathogenic things. But that's a major consideration, and we don't want to compromise in the quality of the donor or the manufacturing standards, which again are a big aspect of safety, to provide a product that would be cheaper but not be safe potentially and not as effective. And so that's just key for us. We want people to get the outcome in a short and safe a manner as possible, and then ultimately for them to not have to be on it forever. The point here is to solve and address the underlying root causes that are the result of some of these underlying issues, inflammation, allergy symptoms, so that the pet and pet owner can move through this, and also prevention. I mean, preventing the onset of other diseases. Allergies is just an early warning sign that there's a leaky gut, there's an inflammatory basis, and if that's left unchecked and or simply covered up by Apoquel or these other ones, it will in time lead to other diseases. And that's, the cost of those things can be astronomical as well.
I've been there. Also been there. I'm glad you mentioned that because I was just going to piggyback off of what you said. I think that it's still getting missed with a lot of pet parents just because maybe the education isn't out there yet. I think we know the importance of the gut, but just like in humans, the immune system is housed in the gut. 70 to 90% is the estimates, and it's the same in dogs. So like Jason mentioned, if we see a leaky gut, if we see an IBD, the first place it's going to come out is in the skin. Why is that? Because skin is our largest organ. And that inflammation heads from the gut right to the skin. And so oftentimes, if the gut is imbalanced, little things that the immune system could usually handle all of a sudden become a trigger. You're going to hear more about my journey with my dog, Darla, but just as a little example, she had massive IBD and leaky gut. And I spent years trying to figure out why she would break out in hives when the wind would blow, because she'd get exposed to an inhaled allergy. Right. So, I mean, every time the wind would blow, I got this little pumpkin, cue the steroids, cues the hydrolyzed diet, cue all the things. And what was at the basis of Darla's allergies? She had a massively imbalanced microbiome because she was a rescue dog. And so just like what Dr. Roman is feeding her dogs, what you feed your dog matters. And then that's foundational. FMT, I believe, is just as foundational because it is the fast track to balancing it out. Jason, let's talk a little bit about how the community, let's touch on it for a second, on how this leads to allergies, the community in the microbiome, and why just throwing probiotics at it is no longer the way to go.
All right. You ready for me to get on the hot seat? Because this is a very fascinating topic and one that I enjoy ranting on. So the core distinction between FMT, fecal microbiota transplant, or microbiota transplant is really that these live bacteria engraft, meaning they seed in, they become a part of your pet's gut microbiome, and they stay there, and they continue to moderate the climate, the bugs that are there are not allowed in, or moderate the quantities of them. And that distinction is very different from probiotics, which do not engraft. They don't become a permanent part of your microbiome community. They'll go through, they'll have some potentially transient benefits, but if you stop taking them, they stop working. And I do think actually that there's an argument to be made that long-term or high dosing of very few strains of probiotics could in itself create a dysbiotic, imbalanced gut microbiome. And so I don't outright say don't do probiotics, because I do think that there's some positive research there. And in short-term use cases, I think there's potential benefit. But from a long-term dosing perspective, I don't think there's an advantage. And we actually encourage people to stop taking probiotics during the course of an FMT treatment, because we're trying to give a balanced microbiome, not balanced microbiome with tilting the scales of, hundreds of thousands or even billions of, say, lactobacillus or bipido or other strains that are commonly used. So that's a real key distinction between a live microbiome transplant versus a probiotic. When it comes to allergies, the importance is really, it comes down to inflammation. So inflammation in the gut creates leaky gut. It damages the gut junction. So the gut lining is only a few cell layers thick, and it has these gap junctions. And so you could imagine it's meant to be a tight system like this. But when you have a lot of inflammation, you damage the gut lining and you start to create permeability. You start to allow proteins to leak through. And the immune system does its job. And when a protein from food or from some environmental factor begins leaking through that gut lining prematurely, like it should have gone in a more broken down, more digested state later on in the digestive tract. But if it starts leaking out earlier and it's a large protein that the body's not used to, it thinks it's an invader. It thinks, oh boy, there's bad guys here. Let's kill it. And as soon as the immune system is activated to a protein of that sort, it creates an immune response and a memory to that immune response, and it starts attacking it, which further creates more inflammation. And as this protein is continually exposed, whether it's from the food, right? Some dogs get allergic to chicken or beef or you name the food protein, and or the wind, and really it's the protein in that food or environmental exposure that, when released prematurely into the system via the blood, the immune system creates a huge response, and the dog gets itchy, it gets inflamed, it gets, loses hair, it becomes irritable, it's licking its paws all day, it's itchy, there's something wrong. And I always tell people the skin is really just a reflection. It's a mirror to the gut. And so if you're seeing a presentation of skin issues, you absolutely know that there's inflammation and issues similar to the skin going on in the gut. And so the whole point of, this sort of root cause approach that we're talking about is to moderate and create balance of the microbes in the gut, which have anti-inflammatory action and actually produce via short chain fatty acids the building blocks and the fuel source to these cells and gap junctions that we're talking about, so that instead of being open and porous like this, they can form together like this and stop this leakage of these proteins and other inflammatory compounds into the blood and body prematurely, so that over time, this immune response can come down and the dog can then no longer be reactive to these foods. And that's the same sort of concept of like eliminating a food or going on an elimination type diet. You're reducing the exposure to these proteins so that over time, the immune reaction becomes less. But if you're not at the same time trying to rebuild the microbiome and rebalance the community of microbes there, allowing for the healing of this gut lining, you're just going to be sort of banging your head against a wall. And that's the nature of this sort of cycle of medications and other things just to manage symptoms. You're looking at it from the wrong end. We got to start more foundational. And that's where microbiome restorative therapies can be a real adjunct to these other sort of, more integrative functional approaches, whether it's dietary changes or supplementation, whether it be like glutamine or other things that people think about from a gut healing perspective. This is a real synergistic approach to holistic pet care.
Well, and I think oftentimes one of the things that I do so often with clients is two things. And I want to touch on what you said is this is over time. And I want to emphasize that I feel like maybe some of the drugs could be the quick fix, but they can only cover that for so long. And you're going to end up spending some of these, I'm looking, apical side point, thousands a year, possibly, to not get anywhere, maybe have some gnarly side effects, and you're not getting the true gut. But what I do so often with clients is what Jason just talked about. You've got to, one, remove the triggers. So oftentimes that means an elimination diet or getting rid of what they've normally been eating and opt for other proteins that they haven't been eating at all. What does that do? That gives the body a break. And simultaneously, we're pulling in the FMT. So the gut gets a chance to repair while we've eliminated triggers. And I have seen time and time again that rather than going through this for years, I went through this for years and years and years and years. We can find true healing in a matter of months, usually in about 3.
Isn't that phenomenal?
It is. But I also, again, like to emphasize that it's not a quick fix, and true healing does take some time when we have got to rebalance the gut. What would you say to pet parents who are a little bit hesitant still to take this on? Like, oh, I don't know about my dog taking, another dog's poo in a capsule, and isn't that gross? And can they smell it? I've heard this before. Can they smell it? And is it going to be hard? And we get the ick.
Yeah. On the point of can they smell it? I mean, I'm sure some dogs can. I mean, heck, dogs are used for like drug sniffing and bong sniffing and all kinds of stuff. So I wouldn't be all that surprised if they could smell something. But I mean, come on, dogs eat almost anything depending on the dog, and they'll rummage through garbage. So I don't think your dog is the one who's concerned about consuming this. With that said, it is double encapsulated, it's enteric coated. And so the likelihood of them smelling or tasting anything is pretty low, if not very low. And let's also not forget, anytime they meet another dog, where's the first place that their nose goes? So I don't think the dog is the one that's icked out here. Otherwise, I think, we talked briefly about the manufacturing side of things. And that's a part of this. It's not just poop in a pill. We're actually filtering out a lot of what would be considered like non-medically beneficial or inactive parts of a stool, which is largely fiber. A huge percentage of the stool is actually fiber. And so we're actually filtering out for a lot of this fibrous content, and we're concentrating for the microbes that are within this healthy, balanced microbiome. So we're really concentrating it so that it is basically, it looks like a probiotic, really. It's a freeze-dried powder within a double encapsulated pill, and it doesn't open up prematurely. I mean, if you just had it sitting in water, of course, eventually the capsule is going to break down. But if you're just giving it to your dog quickly, whether just popping it in their mouth or mixing it in with a treat or a pill putty or something like that, they're going to be able to get it back no problem quickly. And so it's not really poop. I don't personally think there's anything to be grossed out here, but yeah, I've been in this space for a very long time. I'll have dinner conversations about poop, so I'm probably the wrong person to ask in that context. And my wife endearingly refers to me as the poop doctor, which is, yeah, it's a term I've now fully embraced. But yeah, I at the end of the day, if this is not right for you, if you're preferring to go a different route that includes not dealing with root cause symptoms, by all means. I mean, I don't really consider myself to be in the convincing business. I find that people who have spent long enough trying to deal with it the sort of conventional way and are feeling frustrated have a very easy time sort of overcoming those fears. And once they see the product and start using the product, there's nothing really that is too off-putting for it. In the human context, if people have concerns about it, ultimately my thing is, well, you're just not sick enough, So when you see your dog or yourself personally suffering enough, you're going to reach a point where you're going to be willing to make a change, make an adjustment. And for different people, that's at different pain levels. And, it is what it is.
Well, and it really, I mean, if we need to think of it as a different way, it's the OG probiotic.
Really is. Yeah, I mean, and this is an interesting concept. And sometimes I wonder, and, look, I'm not a veterinarian. I'm not a pet health coach. I'm just a microbiome fanatic. But I do think that dogs generally are very intelligent and much more connected to their natural instincts than, say, us humans. Us humans, we've kind of lost our natural instincts in a lot of ways, where we aren't so tuned into what we need to get from nature, other than, of course, just consuming calories, which is and breathing, which are sort of very foundational. But I do think in some contexts, dogs are actually, it's coprophagia. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but they're basically eating another dog's stool. And I do think potentially there's some sort of behavioral aspect to that in some dogs. But I think overwhelmingly they understand that their microbiome is imbalanced. And so they're ingesting another dog's, stool to try to rebalance their own gut microbiome. But as we well know, most dogs wandering around, dog parks or other places are generally not super healthy. And so it's something you're going to want to try to avoid. And I think if you do have a dog dealing with that, this is a way of addressing that. And hopefully the combination of, some behavioral, training and addressing potentially underlying microbiome imbalances will get rid of this, what I would consider to be a fairly annoying, activity.
Well, and you're right. And I mean, just to follow up on that, there are definitely some imbalances that make dogs want to eat another dog's poo. A lot of pet parents struggle with it. There's fermentation process that goes on in the gut, and dogs crave that fermentation. Remember back in the day when dogs lived outside the majority of the time and they're like in touch with the soil? And I grew up on a farm where our dogs would run around like eating cow poop and horse apples. High microbiome happiness and fermentation. Or when, I know this is gross, but I'm going to say it, when our dogs would eat the cow after birth, that they buried 2 days before, and they were eating Co-op special, but they were healthy as horses, these dogs.
Right.
And so we find often that if we can increase the fermentation, it balances out some mineral imbalances, and then dogs don't go for the Tootsie Rolls anymore.
I like that characterization of Tootsie Rolls, although it might turn people off who like Tootsie Rolls. I don't know. I'm not a Tootsie Roll kind of a guy, so I don't relate. But yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely something to that, right? And that same context is in humans, right? We've kind of become much more sterilized. Most people aren't working with their hands in soil. Most people aren't walking around barefoot anymore. Most people aren't hugging trees, although I like to advise people to do that because, trees have a great microbiome and a lot of wisdom. But yeah, I think in general, we've become much more sterilized, and that move away from exposing ourselves to an environment that would support our microbiome and fermentation actually has negative health consequences. And so, I think it's great when dogs go out into nature and expose themselves, whether that's rolling around in water, swimming, playing with sticks, eating grasses, all the things that, some of that, like eating grasses, could be a negative sign if it's happening all the time and they're vomiting and there's other issues. But outside of that and just their natural inclinations, I think it's great to support dogs with that. And that's a big part of supporting their microbiome as well. It's just the environment, the earth, the soil is the original microbiome. That's where we got our microbiome from, so as dogs. And so I think it's important to try to expose our dogs to that, avoiding, of course, lawns that are sprayed with pesticides, all the other things that we know damage and harm the gut microbiome. But as a starting place, I do think it's a great idea to try to expose your dog or allow themselves to expose themselves to, things that are supportive of their microbiome health, both digestive system wise and their skin. I mean, even my dogs, they'll just roll in weird places. They'll do weird things. And it's they're dogs. That's how they're building up their microbiome. I'm not bathing them every day just because I don't like that they've rolled in some dust. It is what it is, and it sort of comes with the naturally rearing concept of just really support the dogs as they are in the environment that they're used to and that they've been thriving in for hundreds or thousands or however many years ago. These canine species came to evolve from dogs or wolves or wherever else they originally bred off from.
Well, and I was going to say, that is exactly how Dr. Roman is raising her dogs. They are out running around in the woods. Their paws are in the earth. They're doing all those things.
And this is actually a really, I think, a good distinction to point out, because sometimes people make the assumption that we're running this dog breeding farm where these dogs are just stuck in crates and the only thing they're used for is harvesting their stool, and that's the end of it. But it couldn't be farther from the truth. I mean, they're raised so lovingly, and, they're probably considered members of the family, more than the actual members of the family. But I think that's an important distinction. A part of health and well-being is being loved for and cared for in a meaningful way. You can't have a healthy microbiome when you're in a stressful environment. And we know this because there's studies on this. For example, in other animals like mice. Mice under stress will have a poor microbiome health. And anybody who's, seen a poorly run or heard a poorly run dog or puppy mills or things of the like would totally understand how that's a stressful environment and it's not going to be supportive of the dog's gut health and microbiome. I mean, Dr. Margot Roman's dogs, they live on virgin woods. There's a lake nearby that they walk around every day, a couple times a day. I mean, these dogs are getting so much love, care, and attention that is another aspect in addition to diet and other things that can be done to support microbiome health. Those things are going to have a meaningful impact on the microbiome health and well-being. So it's not the reason to love and care for them, but it's a very significant and important reason to support them in those ways to help them have a more healthy, balanced gut microbiome that you're getting when you're doing a treatment.
Yeah, it really is so important. And it's so important to just let dogs be dogs. We really sometimes try to protect them a little too much, and it's a hard lesson I had to learn. Tying that all together with my own dog, Darla, and y'all are going to hear this story later because it's a whopper, but tying this all together, she got the nastiest case of C. diff 3 years ago. One, because she was under stress, just like Jason had talked about, because we had a foster dog that she didn't care for. And 2, I had been giving her a probiotic for years that was one of the highest CFUs, colony forming units, available. But she was imbalanced. It was only eating one strain. Her gut wasn't working as a community because the knowledge was, and the logic was, Jason, correct me, then is give the highest CFUs and the probiotics possible. And C. diff can't happen. It's almost impossible. Well, I can tell you differently.
Yeah, I mean, in some cases, people might get success by doing that in the short term to resolve some symptoms. But again, it's not really addressing the underlying cause. And what makes a microbiome healthy? It's not about how many of a few strains of bacteria you have. It's actually really about balance. So it's a lot of different strains and then a lot of them. So it's still imbalanced if you have a lot of good probiotics or bacteria in the gut. Like, you can have too much of a good thing in this context. And that's really the key here, is it's about balance. And in the context of what you're describing with a dog, that's a rescue dog, we just don't know much about their history. We don't know where they came from. And we actually have large rescue organizations buying in bulk products from us. And these people are awesome that they're doing this. But they tell me, they say, look, when we get a dog, we don't know where they came from. And usually they're, not well and they have symptoms or whatnot. They hit them with the book. I mean, they put them on everything, antibiotics, antiparasitics. I mean, flea and tick. I mean, they're doing everything. They're just knocking them. And I understand, they're introducing this dog into another setting of other dogs and they don't want to spread everything around. And the next thing you know, a somewhat healthy dog gets sick because you introduced a sick dog. And so their sort of playbook is just knock everything out and then, hopefully they build back. But the reality is that when you've received that dog after they spent a certain amount of time in a shelter or wherever else they might have come from, they've been hit with all kinds of stuff, not to mention the months, days, years, however much time that they were not under your care and not under the care of these rescue organizations. We don't know what they were doing, what they were exposed to. A lot of people are bringing dogs in from Mexico and other places, which is phenomenal. I love it all. We've got a rescue dog too. It's great. But you just don't have appreciation for where they came from, if they were born vaginally, what the mom's medical history was like, what they were eating. I mean, there's so many unknowns. And so if you're in that situation and you have all of these unknowns, it's a great opportunity. And even if you're buying a dog from a reputable breeder, I mean, unless they're paying a lot of attention to rearing them naturally, they're also getting exposure to all kinds of stuff in the 8, 10, 12, whatever weeks that you waited to get the puppy. And so I think that's an important variable for people to consider in this context as well.
Yeah. Well, and it's so often that, I feel like we could have a whole another half hour on this, but so often antibiotics and steroids are the first line of defense in most conventional treatments when it comes to skin allergies that have developed into an atopic dermatitis, where we're really starting to get some hot spots and things like that. And the logic has been, well, let's give some antibiotics to prevent an infection. And then it just predisposed the dog to have even more imbalances and more allergy issues. And I would always recommend doing an FMT after any kind of antibiotic treatment, because again, this is a fast track to getting the microbiome, all those good beneficial bacteria, and even the bad guys. In some cases, when the good guys are in the right proportions, they have to work as a community. It's about how they work as a community in balance, as Jason said, not about just beating one strain. Again, that can be beneficial, but if you want a fast track to getting that gut back in balance, time for a little poo. But I want it. Go ahead.
No, you're right. I mean, and that's it's important to mentally make that adjustment in your head, right? When you're thinking about the healthcare for either yourself or your pet, is really understanding that there's, it's about relying on the natural things that we have in our body, our immune system, our microbiome health. Like you need to move away from this concept of let's just kill everything. In some cases, it's required, but these things arise and they're a sign of an imbalance. And so the way to treat them is not to just kill and sort of try to knock all of these symptoms down, because that invariably in time will lead to much bigger, more significant problems and symptoms. And so it's kind of like, you're doing this short-term solution, but long-term, you're creating a much bigger problem. And so the goal, in some cases, absolutely, you got to go with a short course of something to deal with this. Otherwise, you're going to go crazy. Your dog might go crazy. But once you've gotten through this acute phase, how do you rebuild? How do you make sure that this is unlikely to happen again, if ever? And then how do you prevent some of these more chronic diseases and issues that are arising in alarming levels in dogs and cats around the world?
Well, and there'll be a lot more to come on that. So your partner, Greg, has said that he likes to call it microbiome bacterial transfer therapy. Is that easier for everyone? We don't.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, you mentioned the icky part, right? The icky part of fecal microbiota transplant. And so I think microbiome transplant therapy, MTT is another great way to characterize this, microbiome transplant therapy. And that's indicating that there's more than just the microbiome that's happening. And so, depending on who's using this product, whether it's a vet, sometimes they're combining it with other therapies like ozone. In other cases, they're combining it with other supplements or dietary changes. And so I think it can be, characterized well as a MTT, microbiome therapy, or microbiome transplant therapy, or something of that nature. So I think it's a good way to describe it.
And I wanted to clarify something for pet parents. When you talk about that, it's double enteric coated. Can you tell us a little bit about more? It doesn't mean that it's opening in the stomach. It's going down and it's opening in the small bowel. So it's not like your dog is literally eating poo.
Correct. And the importance of have a delayed opening is that the whole point of elevated stomach acid is to try to, of course, break proteins down as the primary thing. But secondarily, or as important, they're also there to try to kill off pathogenic stuff. And so we don't want a high pathogen count to come from the food. And in many cases, that's happening, right? Like depending what dogs are eating, where they're eating, what they're breaking into, they could be getting a lot of pathogens. And so stomach acid is there to kill off pathogens and or bacteria. But we don't want to kill these off. We want them to survive and get to the small and large intestine. And so that's the whole goal of an enteric coated, is that coating on the capsule keeps it closed in the exposure to the stomach acid so that it begins opening in the small and then, transitioning from the small into the large bowel where there's, millions of microbes. So that's the whole point is to really try to preserve the FMT, the microbiome product until it reaches the small intestine where then it'll open.
Yeah, and just survive that stomach acid because you're right. Dogs have an insanely acidic stomach, correct, and that's why they can gobble down raw food if that is your choice. And oftentimes it can be a prime diet for them because their stomachs can handle it. Nothing can survive that acid. So, Jason, looking ahead, what innovations or developments do you foresee in the realm of pet gut health and microbiome research?
That's a good question. I think, we're still very early in our understanding of like what truly makes a healthy gut microbiome in both humans and pets. So that's still a very early development. I do think that, MTT or FMT or microbiome therapeutics are also still very early in the development and our understanding. I think as a healthcare community broadly, including veterinarians and pet health coaches and nutritionists and so on, are beginning to realize that, the microbiome plays a very critical role in all disease, especially all chronic disease. And so I think in time we'll become more precise in the way that we're addressing treatment. And we won't have a blanket approach to, dog presents with X symptoms, so I give it Y drug. We're going to be much more precise and sort of have this much more individualized, patient-centric approach based on, their genomic profile, based on their microbiome profile, based on a lot of factors that give us real data. And then with that data, we can start to understand, okay, what types of therapeutics, whether they're drugs or whether they're other products, that would be much more precise in their method of action so that we're not just creating a large-scale disruption as we do and we're just giving, say, a very broad-spectrum antibiotic. Because in time, and we're already seeing this as being true today, we're creating antibiotic resistance. And this is going to become, and I keep talking about this, But it's going to become a huge issue, and it already is an issue, but it's going to become an even bigger issue if we don't stop this sort of wide scale use of antibiotics. And frankly, antibiotics are the most obvious category, but even things like pesticides and herbicides and other things that we know damage the gut microbiome, it allows these superbugs to survive and thrive. If they don't get killed by the antibiotic, they just evolve to become even stronger and more resistant to antibiotics. And there's always the concerns, right, of like what could transfer from a dog into a human, and then you create a pandemic situation. So, I think that's the future hopefully looks like us being much more diligent about the drugs that we're using that we know damage the gut microbiome. And so that means getting more vets thinking holistically, integratively, functionally, etc. And then also aligning that thinking with the foods that we know support a healthy gut microbiome. But then beyond that, just making more informed decisions with data based on research and clinical practice. So I think there's, we're in a healthcare revolution, and I think this is FMT or microbiome transplants are a very exciting portion or part of that. And I think they can deal with a lot of these, chronic diseases that are plaguing both people and pets alike. And so it's an exciting time. And I think in the next, decade or more, we're going to see a lot of these chronic diseases be completely eliminated.
I hope so. I'm here for that ride. I mean, that's why we're both here, because it's already popping up. VDI has a microbiome test where it's showing now on the test the antibiotic resistant bacteria. So there is another way. And I will say that when Darla had that awful C. diff, you want to know how she got through it? It wasn't an antibiotic. It was ozone and a Legacy Biome FMT. Within 9 days, she tested negative. And this was the dog that had had horrible allergies for years and years and years, and I didn't want to set her back. And it's what got me started so much in the gut. And guess what? She has a darn near perfect microbiome today, according to the test. No allergy issues, and she's 15. So
let the wind blow.
Let the wind blow, and it is right now. Well, I feel like we'll have to do this like 7 more times, because I feel like there's so many topics that we brought up today that we just couldn't flesh out.
Cliffhangers, it'll keep all of you guys listening, I hope. I agree this was an awesome conversation, and I'd love to do it again.
Sounds good. Well, Jason, I appreciate so much of your time today. It is so nice to talk to you and hear what's going on in your microbiome brain, because I rarely find somebody who likes to talk about this as much as I do. And
you've met your match.
You've been doing this longer than I have. So anyways, well, he is a man on a mission, and I am here as your pet's gut health advocate. And we're going to keep rolling on this journey as we find these new therapies, as FMT becomes foundational, not a last resort. And we wish you and all your pets a happy gut.